Good afternoon, and welcome to the final webinar in the Accelerated Learning Summer Webinar Series. Our presenter this afternoon is Dr. Clay Cook. Dr. Cook is the John W. and Nancy E. Payton Faculty Fellow in Child and Adolescent Wellbeing, professor and core faculty in the Institute of Translational Research in Children's Mental Health. Dr. Cook's research investigates the development, evaluation, and implementation of evidence-based practices to improve youth access to needed social, emotional, and behavioral supports in schools. We are honored to welcome Dr. Clay Cook for today's webinar.
Thank you, Melissa. It's an honor and privilege to be able to speak to you all, wherever you all are at in the great state of Michigan. I'm going to, as my topic is, we're going to talk a lot about the integration of social, emotional, and behavioral supports. And I have a game plan here today, and that's to really dig into the why we want to invest in integrating social, emotional, and behavioral supports with academics. I'm going to talk about the what. What does that actually look like? And I'm going to use a metaphor, a baking recipe metaphor, to really think from an ingredients approach. What are the social, emotional, and behavioral ingredients we're trying to combine together in order to achieve the types of outcomes we want for kids? And that is to enable kids to be well, to engage fully in their learning experiences, and ultimately develop and grow their academic selves. And then I'm going to get into the how. How do we actually bring this all to life through very intentional, deliberate implementation? So let's just jump right in. Now, there's an old way of thinking that continues to get us the same results, and we have to think differently. And many systems are doubling down to do what I call academics louder. So they think it's through that new curriculum, or they think just, dedicating even more time to academics that we're going to actually work our way out of some of the circumstances we're confronted with when it comes to student outcomes. And I want to challenge that same old way of thinking that's produced the similar results, and really think about new ways of thinking through, and really from the standpoint of integration. One can argue that innovation really comes through the integration. And you could take, like, as an example, our evolution of our cell phones, where it's really through integration, adding new features and components and integrating them into a whole is where true innovation comes from. And there's a whole science called integrated prevention. And that is, if we integrate supports that attend to students' holistic needs, we can actually enhance the probability of attaining important outcomes, including those achievement outcomes that many schools are held accountable for, and that ultimately position kids to transition into post-secondary education life with the academic knowledge and skills to go into college, career, or just be life ready. So really think about social, emotional, and behavioral supports from the lens of integrating with academics, so more kids are able to access what they need, and that promotes them being well, socially, emotionally well. That supports their engagement in their learning experiences, so they're more likely to profit from the learning experiences that are created for them. And over time, those accrue benefits when it comes to achievement and meeting certain standards. So I want to come back to the idea I've already touched on here. That is, we want kids to engage and perform skillfully in the context of their learning experiences. One question that needs to be asked then, what leads and predicts whether students are going to engage and perform skillfully? And one element is that students are well. They need to be well. To engage and perform skillfully, someone needs to be well. Here's where we could start to decompose what do we mean by be well. One element of that is socially well. When we think about socially well, kids need to feel a strong sense of belonging and connection as part of a broader community. All it takes is thinking about when kids don't feel like they belong, and we can start to think through what are the types of behaviors we're likely to see when kids don't feel like they belong and they're not a valued, respected member of that place. It causes them to be unwell. It minimizes their engagement, and they don't perform as skillfully. That is true for any human. Kids need to be physically well too. Physically well means having a high sense of vitality and energy so you can plug into certain experiences, especially learning experiences, whereby we're having kids take on and learn new tasks, which is very demanding from a cognitive load perspective. Kids need to have a high amount of vitality and energy to be able to plug into their learning experiences. What we know is things like sleep. The average middle schooler is chronically sleep deprived. Some of our school start times for secondary age kids don't let students biologically get the sleep they need to be well and they engage and perform skillfully. Now, emotionally well means free from distress and having a positive mood or affect. Think about it. If kids are having fun, they have a sense of pride, they're happy, those all enable kids to engage. Now, if kids are anxious, if they're fearful, they feel a sense of embarrassment or shame as a result of being in school context, those mean kids aren't emotionally well, and that minimizes engagement in their performance. So when we think about integrating social, emotional, and behavioral supports, on one level, we're trying to make sure kids are well, socially, physically, and emotionally well to promote their engagement. And on another level, we're also teaching certain competencies that aren't necessarily academically focused, but they're enablers. They enable students to better regulate themselves in social and academic circumstances. Now, if we look at the reason why we need to invest in integrating social, emotional, and behavioral supports, we have what I consider a crisis in our public school system when it comes to belonging. When we look at data for secondary age students, up to 40% of students report that there's not a single adult in the building who cares for them. They lack sense of belonging. And if we look at achievement motivation or predictors of engagement in classroom learning experiences, we find that one of the most potent predictors, sense of belonging and connection to the person in charge who has power and authority over them and is designing the experience, there's not a trusting relationship. So this is where we need to intentionally integrate social, emotional, and behavioral supports to go after with vigor to promote a sense of belonging for all students. And we have inequities that exist through many systems, because if you actually go to tell the story in a given school about who belongs and who doesn't belong, we start to realize that BIPOC students, students from lower socioeconomic backgrounds, students with IEPs, report the lowest levels of belonging, and we would argue that they actually have the highest need for relationships. So what are some other problems that necessitate us changing to integrate social, emotional, and behavioral supports? We know that mental health needs that kids bring to the educational table are common. The most common areas of illness for adolescents, children and adolescents, are depression and anxiety. We know that disruptive behaviors, many families go to their primary care physicians and hear about that disruptive behaviors are a common occurrence. And so we have many needs, social, emotional, and behavioral needs students bring to the educational table that can either enable or disable their own learning experiences or that of others. So intentional design to make sure we're going eyes wide open and recognize that students are bringing these needs to the educational table is paramount. Now, this comes from some research from the National Academies of Sciences where they tried to explore what are the most potent risk factors for the development of adjustment and mental health problems. Some of these that you'll see here are the usual suspects: poverty, trauma, exposure to discrimination and racism increase the likelihood for adjustment and mental health problems for people. That's why we need structural supports in schools. We got to think about designing healthy, safe environments that inoculate or protect kids against these types of adverse experiences. But one thing you'll see at the bottom here that's risen to the top as being just as likely to promote adjustment and mental health problems is high achieving schools. High achieving schools are just as potent of a predictor. They operate in different ways than discrimination rate and racism, trauma, and poverty, but they predict equally as high rates of adjustment and mental health problems. That means creating pressure cooker situations that around academics to win not only on in the classroom, but on the field of play, so to speak, actually takes a toll on the youth within those systems. And so we have to think, yes, we're in pursuit of promoting high levels of academic outcomes for kids, but how do we compensate for the pressure that puts on young people within those contexts? And how do we actually put in supports that help manage the potential negative side effects that come along with really creating an approach that's trying to maximize test scores and help kids reach high levels of achievement? Here's some data that is pretty startling in my opinion. So what you're seeing here is from the Journal of American Medical Association. What the yellowish goldish line is emergency department visits due to mental health related concerns. The blue line is emergency department visits due to health or medical issues. Now, what you can see is from 2007 to 2015, there was 100% increase in the number of emergency department visits due to mental health related issues, whereas those same emergency department visits for medical issues remain the same. Now, if we start to look even closer at this, the biggest increase was among 5 to 11-year-old groups. So we've seen a huge increase in the number of young kids who are being hospitalized due to suicidal ideation and attempts. And in response to COVID, we've seen this increase by another over 30% more in terms of emergency department visits due to mental health related concerns. So when we think about integrating social, emotional, and behavioral supports, we're bringing a focus around mental health and how do we promote mental health and put in services and supports when students are struggling with mental health problems. Additional problems that necessitate us doing and thinking differently is we have long-standing disparities that continue to persist despite well-intended efforts. Students living in poverty, students from historically marginalized groups, BIPOC groups, are less likely to have secure relationships with educators, less likely to receive effective services, more likely to receive ineffective supports or practices such as exclusionary discipline, more likely to be referred for special education, and placed in restrictive settings away from their peers. So we have to think at the root, there is social, emotional, and behavioral needs that are being unmet and properly served and not equitably accessed across students. So I want us to think about, and this is where I'm going to introduce some ideas around design thinking in education. How do positive changes in student outcomes come about? If you're really to reflect on, we want these types of positive outcomes to come about, but what's the process by which those outcomes come about for an individual? And if you can, just reflect, think through, how do positive student outcomes come about? Like, I want these outcomes over here. How do I help make them come about? And so if you were thinking through some things, what you probably realize is outcomes come about as a result of experience. We all have senses. That's how we take in our experiences. And so the quality of experiences, the quality of the teaching learning experiences, the quality of the relational experiences, the quality of the environment I take in to enable me to feel safe, have a sense of predictability, and be in a regulated emotional state, those experiences are going to determine the types of outcomes. So what we have to do is really boil down, what are the daily consistent, enriched experiences students need to access to be well, to engage and perform skillfully in order to develop and grow over time. And we can really start to boil things down in terms of experience. Now, if you started to categorize types of experiences students take into school, nobody gets up in the morning as an educator and says, hey, I want to create a harmful experience for a kid. But if we're not careful, many students are being exposed to harmful experiences, relationship experiences that harm their sense of belonging and connection to school, harmful instructional experiences that decrease their confidence and their motivation to want to plug in. Some of the experiences are just basic. They're not potent or strong enough to actually move the needle on the outcome, but they're not harmful either. They're just kind of basic, and I call them meh. They're just kind of benign. And then there's enriched experiences. Enriched experiences are those experiences when accessed and consistently received on a day in, day out basis, they're strong and potent enough to promote and produce the outcomes that we're really trying to go after. So that's what we're going to start to explore here is what are the enriched experiences? Now, backwards design as a concept is really starting with the outcomes we want to achieve as a result of what we do, and then thinking through, okay, what are the enriched experiences students need to access in order to produce those outcomes? Once we get a sense of the enriched experiences, what are the effective practices that we need to select and implement to bring to life those enriched experiences so students are consistently accessing them so we can achieve the outcomes? And that's the idea of backwards design when we're integrating social, emotional, and behavioral supports. We have to first start with those outcomes. Positive outcomes come about as a result of accessing enriched experiences. Those enriched experiences can be brought to life very intentionally and deliberately by educators through the selection and implementation of effective practices. So let me give you, there's going to be a few examples that I'm going to give you around outcomes like sense of belonging, emotional well-being, behavioral engagement. Those are all enablers for kids to plug in more fully to their learning experiences, and they're more likely to accelerate their learning. And if they did have a gap, close those types of gaps. So when we think about the outcomes, and those of you that are familiar with positive behavior intervention supports, they have a model that I consider everybody should live by, and that is outcomes, practices, systems, and data. You always need to start with the outcomes. The outcomes represent what we want to achieve and happen as a result of what we do. One useful way to think about outcomes, to get very intentional and deliberate about the experiences we want students to take in and how we will intentionally and deliberately bring about those experiences through the implementation of effective practices, is proximal outcomes, intermediate outcomes, and distal outcomes. Many schools speak in the form of distal outcomes, things that are slower to come about and actually come about as a result of proximal and intermediate outcomes. Some of you, if this language is familiar, this is how you design your own logic model or theory of action. So we need to start with the outcomes. Proximal outcomes typically reflect internal things going on with students that impact ultimately what we see with regard to student behavior and performance. Their perceptions, their thoughts, their feelings, their motivational states. These internal things are most likely to change in response to experience, versus achievement takes time to actually change and accrue. So when we start to get really crisp in our understanding of the outcomes we're going about, we specify those things that are most malleable or responsive to experiences that are going to change pretty immediately, or they could not be in place pretty immediately. Like belonging and connection can come about pretty quickly through positive, ongoing, welcoming interactions where someone feels like a valued, respected person. Once belonging's in place, and I've given you every professional learning experience nowadays has to have an iceberg kind of image and metaphor. I'm giving it to you here. Really, these internal factors are things you can't really see, but impact the things we do see with student behavior on the surface, but nonetheless are important, and you really wouldn't know unless someone told you the truth. So those proximal outcomes lead to intermediate outcomes, the things we can see. They're behavioral indicators of performance, like behavior engagement, reduced discipline, use of social emotional skills. Many kids have what we call performance needs. They're not using their social, emotional, and behavioral skills because they're not properly motivated. The internal things aren't going on with them. They don't feel like they're connected. They don't feel a sense of safety and predictability from the environment. So that impacts their ability to use the skills they possess. Attendance, we could see that. Academic growth on formative assessments. What would predict whether kids are going to be plugged in enough to start showing little changes in curriculum measures that are sensitive to growth and ultimately predict status on longer term, more comprehensive tests. So when we get really good from a social, emotional, behavioral standpoint, We start to say, what are the proximal outcomes? And how do I create access to enriched experiences? Those proximal outcomes are going to go after and produce these intermediate outcomes. And ultimately, those intermediate outcomes are going to lead to distal, longer term things. We want to design things to go after the proximal and intermediate outcomes that ultimately get to the distal outcomes. Now, once I've defined the outcomes, I could start to think from a social, emotional, and behavioral perspective, what are the practices that if I implement and they're received by students, more students are going to access kind of those daily enriched experiences that will promote or produce the prioritized outcomes. So what are the practices? So effective practices are essentially spell out intentional and deliberate actions that, if performed, are going to increase students' access to daily enriched experiences that lead to positive outcomes. So I'm essentially creating my own logic model. Well, if I want to produce those proximal outcomes, I need to select effective practices. Those begin to spell out the things I'm going to do very intentionally and deliberately to increase access to daily enriched experiences. PBIS, yes, it's a framework, but it's also practices that help create a sense of predictability and safety for kids because of the deliberate and intentional actions educators are engaging in to proactively teach behavioral expectations, prompt and remind students of those expectations, model them with their own behavior. And if students engage in behaviors inconsistent with those expectations, they're there to address it and use effective accountability mechanisms that are more grounded in teaching versus punishment. And that helps establish a sense of safety and predictability that enables kids to be in regulated states. Those things are going to produce the intermediate outcomes, which will lead to the longer term distal outcomes. So the outcomes come about through accessing enriched experiences, which come through the delivery of effective practices. Now, here's where I want to present a recipe metaphor to think about how do we start to organize the outcomes, how do we organize the experiences that we think students are going to need, and then start to select effective practices that we want to be intentional about implementing so students actually access those enriched experiences they need in order to promote them to be well, to engage fully in their learning experiences, and develop and grow their academic selves. I like the baking recipe metaphor, one, because it outlines and says to get to outcomes, we need very clear guidelines and instructions on how things work together to produce an outcome. It also recognizes that all the outcomes we're really interested in are multiply determined. They don't just come about by doing academics louder. Really, what's interfering with kids' ability to be successful, some of them aren't engaged, some aren't well because we haven't really created the healthy environment, some aren't accessing the relationships they need, and some we haven't empowered and promoted their sense of agency to plug into their experiences. So when we use the recipe, we need to start to think about any outcome we're going after is actually multiply determined by different ingredients. I work with many school systems across the US, and I see many of them, they're investing in a good ingredient. They just don't have the recipe in place. It's like, yeah, continue that. That's a really good ingredient, but that ingredient alone ain't going to get you to the outcome you want. So what is a recipe? It's a set of guidelines and instructions about how to combine ingredients together. How are we going to combine these things? How are we going to integrate with academics so people understand that really there's just student experience. They enter school and then they leave school within a day. We're trying to design the experiences students take in from the relational experiences, the surrounding environment that they're in, as well as their teaching and learning experience. And it's through the combination of enriched experiences that we're pulling together, we're going to increase the likelihood we'll get to those outcomes we want. Too often the work we do in schools is siloed and fragmented. You know, our behavior work lives over here and we can compartmentalize it. You know, our MTSS work is viewed as a different thing and it lives over here. Our academic work is over here, instead of through this integrative lens where we're trying to do is weave them in to kind of a coherent, clear picture on how they work together to get to what we want to achieve, and that's the outcomes. Like all recipes, they're motivated to get to an outcome. Usually when you bake, that's a yummy culinary product, something delicious that you want to eat. One way to think about an outcome is it's what we want to intentionally achieve or happen as a result of what we do. One level in schools where we got to get clarity around is what are the prioritized outcomes we're going after? Because that's going to lock you in to the enriched experiences, because those outcomes are going to come about as a result of experiences. What experiences need to be accessed daily and consistently to get to the outcome? It's not, the outcome's not going to bring itself to life because we're talking about it. So that's what one level is, to prioritize the outcomes. And then we start to think about the experiences and the practices students are going to need to receive in order to get those outcomes. Now, an active ingredient is a part or a component of a recipe that, when combined with other ingredients, produces the outcome. What I see a lot of schools do, like I mentioned, they expect the outcome, but they're going all in on a single ingredient. Many of you have probably seen the video with a little kid who wants to eat cocoa. If you've ever eaten it, it's just really bitter, but he's thinking he's going to get a yummy brownie or something. So he takes a big old scoop of that and just spits it out and has like an aversive reaction. And that's a lot of what I see is happening. We have a good ingredient and we're expecting the outcome. And then often schools move to yet the next new shiny thing because they haven't achieved the outcome, even though they have good practices informed by bringing to life an ingredient. So we really got to start thinking about what are the ingredients of a good recipe that we're trying to combine together that increase the probability we'll actually get the types of outcomes we want from an accelerated learning standpoint. And that's where we start to think about what are these ingredients of a recipe. I like to say there's really robust science for each one of these ingredients. It doesn't mean there's not other important ingredients, but these are all student facing. The ingredients really are categories of enriched experience that we know students need to access in order to be well, to engage fully in their experiences, learning experiences, and ultimately to develop and grow from their baseline. Students need to access safe, predictable, proactive environments. That's an essential ingredient, not a nice one to get to maybe, but an essential one. Students need to, from the social environment, need to access healthy relationships. I call them vertical relationships. That's between people who are in positions of power and authority with students. Usually teachers are most proximal. Those need to be really healthy. And then horizontal relationships between students. What are our practices that we're implementing so kids are accessing daily, healthy relational experiences that promote their sense of belonging and connection to that place? Many schools don't have really common language and dedicated practice when it comes to that, although nearly everybody would say it's important. Now, culturally responsive teaching and learning, we want really good, high quality, relevant, culturally responsive learning experiences. And so we can think about that from a social emotional standpoint. We need good curriculum and instruction that's dedicated to cultivating certain social emotional competencies and dispositions that are enablers to kids' academic and life success. That would be an important component. Student agency or empowerment, it's not about having skills, but it's promoting kids to have really strong, favorable beliefs about themselves, to be future oriented. And there are certain practices we can implement to actually bring to life experiences that promote student agency and empowerment. And from a multi-tiered perspective, we know some kids are going to have needs that go above and beyond even a well-implemented, robust tier 1 level of support. And we need to bring in where kids can access early, timely intervention so they can receive those experiences and supports if their needs warrant it. And so these become the quality of ingredients of a recipe from the integration of social, emotional, and behavioral supports that start to give life to what that work can look like. Now, when you specify kind of a recipe, it puts out, like, the end goal is to integrate, practices that bring to life each of these ingredients, recognizing at any point in time, we can't overwhelm our people. We have to take a really measured continuous improvement approach. So it's something we're incrementally building towards over time, and we select which kind of these ingredients are our priorities in a given year. So here's what we do, what the utility of first spelling out what we think are the essential ingredients are. We use them to inform the selection of effective practices. So here's an example where you take relationships, and we want to do that. And let's look what the literature says as effective approaches that integrate practices in order to bring that ingredient to life. Establish, maintain, restore is a method we've developed. It's absolutely for free. I'm going to give an example of what that looks like in a little bit, but that would be a selection decision. We're selecting to implement that in order to bring to life this ingredient. If you want to bring to life safe, proactive, predictable, and positive environment, well, we're going to choose a culturally responsive approach to PBIS, and we're going to invest in implementing proactive classroom management strategies. That's an example of selecting something that introduces some common language and dedicated practice, so people are working together to bring to life that ingredient. Teaching and learning, you would select a social emotional learning curriculum, and you would provide culturally responsive instruction around that. And that would involve, a named curriculum, something that's branded, something like Second Step, Positive Action, Mind Up. There's a wide range of practices that we can implement. Oh, so a regulated state is kids are emotionally regulated. They're not in kind of like a fight or flight response. I see a question here, and that is like, what do we mean by being in a regulated state? Usually it's first at the emotional level, and then if someone's in a regulated state emotionally, their behavior follows suit. And so we know that kids' emotions and strong emotions can drive their engagement, whether they want to, withdraw or disengage or act out. And so when we create a healthy environment, it really helps more kids be in that kind of regulated state. And that's kind of the internal state. Physiologically, that's, an emotion is really physiology, is kids' physiology where it needs to be so they are well and they can engage fully in their experiences. That's why doing morning routines, doing things like mindful breathing activities, all those things are designed to help kids get in a regulated state and essentially get in their frontal lobe before we engage in a learning experience. And so there's a lot of things we can do to create an environment, and through our relationships, we can help kids get in that place. So I just want to, walk through some specific examples. The idea here is once you've spelled out ingredients that start to define what the social, emotional, and behavioral work would look like, we then use that to select certain effective practices we're going to implement. Going back to that model, what are the outcomes we want to achieve as a result of what we do? What are the effective practices that will increase student access to experiences to produce those outcomes? And then we'll have to explore the how. The how we go about making that happen is through systems of support we provide for our adults to be able to implement those effective practices. So I'm going to give you an example of how to, once the rubber hits the road, we all, as a community of educators, we look at it, we know this is essential. We need to have a relationship ingredient, and we want to be very intentional and deliberate about making sure kids are accessing enriched relational experiences daily and consistently to promote their sense of belonging and connection to school. So we developed a method, as I mentioned. We've done 3 randomized controlled trials on it. We have another one going on. That's an Institute of Education Science funded project as a 9th grade dropout prevention strategy as students transition into 9th grade. EMR is really designed as a teacher-student relationship focused strategy, and it's a universal support. So everybody gets trained on common language around relationships. The common language is to conceptualize the relationship status with kids as either being in the established phase, the maintain phase, or the restore phase, and providing educators with concrete practices and different implementation supports so they have time protected to really reflect on their relationship status with kids, identify practices that could be helpful to either establish, maintain, or restore those relationships, and develop plans within certain intervals of time. One of the main implementation supports we use in AMR is a dedicated structured PLC protocol where people go through this kind of reflection process. Now, it's built on the premise that we need to spend more time depositing into relationships with kids to build that strong sense of connection and belonging to the classroom learning environment as one of the best predictors of engagement. All things else being considered equal with regard to curriculum and instruction, if we can optimize engagement through really strong, healthy social connections that cultivate a sense of belonging, that's going to accelerate learning unto itself. And for many kids, this kind of prerequisite for engagement is not in place. As I told you, that 40% of secondary age kids and beyond report that they don't feel like they belong. There's not a adult in the building who they think really does care deeply about them. So when we look at these are just our established practices. We have what's called an EMR playbook, and the EMR playbook just has practice profiles and guidance on how to deliver each of they're essentially implementation scripts. A couple of the signature practices are banking time. So a teacher who has not yet established a relationship with a kid would, protect time to meet with the kid individually. We provide open, developmentally and culturally appropriate open-ended questions where you can get a conversation started to start to learn about the kid, actively listen, appropriately self-disclose, so the kid's learning about and starting to see their teacher beyond they start to see them as a person, and the teacher starts to see the student as a person as well. Express empathy, but it's really a way in which we scaffold a positive interaction so the adult can start to deposit into the relationship. Another signature practice, a lot of teachers do this on their own, is what we call talk them up to other adults. This strategy is largely about identifying something the kid said, did, or achieved, or put in energy and effort to do, and relay that compliment through another adult, a meaningful adult in the kid's life. Could be another teacher, a counselor, administrator, a family member, caregiver, guardian, or parent. So that strategy can be very skillful, especially when you have not yet established a relationship with a kid, because when you directly compliment someone and there's a string attached, many people don't know the motive behind the compliment, and they could take it as being manipulated or coercive. As an example, I'm a teacher in a classroom and I compliment a kid for sitting down and being quiet. That starts to take on, like, the reason why you gave me a compliment is just to get me to shut up. Outside of knowing a healthy relationship, some kids are uncertain about how to take those compliments. Now, talking them up through other adults, indirect compliments, there's research indicating that can be more powerful in the initial stages of relationship when a healthy relationship has not yet been established. So I'm just giving you an idea. We have this ingredient. Now we got to select effective practices to implement, and we start to introduce that into our system to go about increasing students' access to those enriched relational experiences so they feel a sense of belonging and connection to their learning environments. Now we take it a step farther in EMR because we have implementation supports that enable people to routinely come back and reflect on how they're doing, check in with their relationship status with their students, and develop what we call student-specific relationship action plans. And so there's an example of our reflection form. The goal is to identify kids in the establish or restore. If the kid's in one of those, what we call vulnerable relationship states, those are kids who the teacher should focus on, not the kids in the maintain from an equity standpoint. And then we have an equity reflection. Is gender related to, students being in these vulnerable places, as race, ethnicity. And then the student action plans are really starting to spare out what practices am I going to use by when, how will I hold myself accountable, and how will I remember to follow through with this plan for this student. Ideally, something like this happens monthly. So this would be a monthly PLC where there's month intervals where teachers are really focusing on the subset of students for whom don't feel a strong sense of belonging and connection to their learning environment, and they're bringing some intentionality and purpose to interacting with students to really go after cultivating a sense of belonging and connection. The research we've done is pretty clear. As people commit to engaging in this PLC process, more and more students over the course of a year are reporting like they belong. We tend to see higher rates of academic engagement, lower rates of disruptive behaviors as enablers to longer-term distal academic outcomes. So that's an example of taking that relationship ingredient. Now, the environment ingredient falls within the umbrella of social, emotional, and behavioral supports. We're trying to enable to create this healthy, influential context that enables students to consistently exhibit behaviors that promote their learning and help co-create an environment where others are able to get what they need out of that place. And so then we think about, how do we actually do this? Now, one thing I just want to point out is we have a misnomer around even concepts like self-regulation. Regulation, someone being in a regulated state, is more a byproduct of the environment than it is their own individual assets and skills. The more predictable, the research is quite clear, the more predictable and consistent the environment, the more regulated people are within that environment. If you want to dysregulate people where they don't know and anticipate what's going to happen when, that can trigger things, especially for individuals who have a history of trauma, make it an inconsistent, unpredictable environment. So part of creating this healthy environment is to make sure that we're getting on the same page. And I truly fundamentally believe this now. To bring to life this ingredient, the best thing we can be doing in each and every school on the planet is implementing a culturally responsive approach to positive behavior interventions and supports. By far, the methodology that's baked into PBIS, not just it as a framework through which we conceptualize service delivery and access according to student need, but the PBIS practices are the methodology where we go intentionally and deliberately to construct a really predictable environment for kids. And we do that by first getting the adults on the same page. That doesn't mean we don't have voice and input, where we're creating shared agreements across various stakeholders on what are those behavioral expectations. So we're removing kind of cultural loading out of those. So we're making sure the behavioral expectations not only work for kids who are doing well, they're going to work for all kids. But the idea here is, first level of predictability, are the adults on the same page in terms of what they expect and how they're going to respond to student behavior. That's how we start to create predictability as students navigate different settings within a given school context. The methodology is about getting those shared agreements around what are the behavioral expectations and investing more in proactive teaching and modeling of those expectations so students comprehend what it looks like behaviorally to help co-create that positive, peaceful, and productive environment. And then focusing more on providing consistent feedback through acknowledgement and recognition. So we're providing allowing students to feel appreciated for the energy and effort they're putting in to exhibit those behavioral expectations, as well as feedback that involves effective accountability instead of punishment. And effective accountability means we're still setting limits to have conversations and supports with students when they engage in behaviors that are inconsistent with the expectations, but we want to minimize negative side effects that can harm sense of belonging and connection to school, and ultimately turn those instances into teaching opportunities. So that's the methodology. Now, we also have a whole wealth of research on proactive strategies that are designed to promote student engagement as incompatible to problem behavior. The degree to which students are on task, they're not off task. So what are the strategies we can front load that optimize the degree to which students are engaged in their learning experiences? And engagement is how learning comes about. So there's a range of different proactive strategies to create kind of a real structured, consistent, predictable environment through routines and strategies. And this is an ever growing and evolving literature base where we find that we can add different strategies and tactics over the years as people are innovating different methods, proactive methods that promote student engagement and reduce things like learning behaviors that interfere with learning. Here's an example of teaching and learning. I mentioned previously, this is where we're going to do curriculum and instruction, but we're going to dedicate it to SEL, social emotional learning. So it's really expanding the scope. When I work with school systems, I like to go really blow up the teaching and learning department in the school system to really have them reconceptualize what they mean about teaching and learning. Teaching and learning of what competencies, what dispositions or skills. So they start to think differently about what they're supporting students to acquire, learn, and apply to position them to be career, college, and life ready. And SEL skills, when you break it down, you ask employers what are the most important skills. If you look at the best predictors of life success beyond academics, it's social emotional skills. So we start to really think through, okay, what are the things we need to go after in terms of the social emotional standards, and how do we start to align our curriculum and instruction to support students to acquire and apply those competencies in order to position them to be career, college, and life ready. And this really involves, from a school standpoint, when we integrate this, a master scheduling type of conversation and planning process to figure out where do we fit it in, who's responsible to deliver this. And ultimately, this isn't something that we have counselors come do drive-by kind of lessons on. This is something that's typically owned by general education teachers because they spend the most time interfacing with students. Not only can they teach those lessons, they can follow up those lessons to reinforce them, to debrief, and give some of the reps we know is necessary for kids to build fluency. Student agency, I want to give you an example too, what it looks like to start to integrate this work. Here's just two examples of some evidence-based practices. And we want to promote agency. We want kids to be goal-oriented and motivated. There's some short-term goal-setting programs like WOOP, WISH, Outcomes, Obstacles, and Plan, where kids develop short-range goals about their educational wishes, and we help them get clear on those. We help them visualize the outcomes. How cool would it be if they achieve those wishes? And then we start to support them to think about what are the obstacles that could come up, though, that would get in my way get in the way of me achieving that wish or want. And then I have to develop plans, if-then plans. If the obstacle comes up, then what's my plan to overcome that, including advocating for help from trusted others who I can lean on if I feel stuck. Now, this process done in kind of series or cycles helps kids maintain goal orientation. They have a greater sense of agency and purpose, and they're more thinking beyond the immediate and thinking more distally about things they're going after to achieve. Longer term sense of purpose can be cultivated. There's a range of really cool, innovative work that is about future possible selves. One's called the Pathways to Success, where you really sit down, even early on, help kids start to formulate, even though it will evolve over time, future selves. And there's usually three types of future selves. One's like a really optimistic future self, one's a desired but high probability future selves, and one's an undesired future self. And we start to expose students to information about where they could go in their life and how school's connected to them getting there. And so kids start to crystallize future identities. And those future identities about where kids want to go help increase the relevance of instruction, because now educators can map on where kids are thinking they want to go to the instruction and curriculum they're provided. And so this helps people make the work they do with students from an instructional standpoint be more relevant and connected to kids' lives. Now, poverty tends to work against kids having opportunities to really explore potential pathways for their future. So part of this work involves exposing kids to possibilities and experiences about where they could go and how the academics that they're involved in now are helpful to get them there. When this intervention happens, the research indicates kids even rate instruction that they previously thought was tedious, boring, or aversive. They rate it as more acceptable more relevant simply now because they have a future vision for themselves. I hope I've kind of modeled, like, even if you want this, like a student agency and empowerment ingredient, and we think it's important for kids to access experiences that promote this, the question is, what are our practices? We have to select effective practices to implement those practices in order to promote that agency and empowerment as kids orient towards their futures. So I'm going to start to wrap this up with the how, and then we'll open it up for questions and answers. The systems part is super important because here's where implementation comes in. Now, a school system without systems of support for the adults to help them implement, they're not going to go anywhere. It's kind of like a car without any wheels. You can have the highest performance car, you can have the highest performance practices, but if we don't create systems of support around our adults to enable them to adopt and implement well, students ultimately don't receive access to those enriched experiences. So we have to center everything around the adults and maintain a stubborn and relentless approach around student outcomes because it's the adults. And how do we make implementation happen? There is no successful implementation from a school-wide perspective, particularly when integrating social emotional behavioral supports without a dedicated implementation team. That's formal and informal leaders working together in order to support their systems in order to get it in place. So the whole goal here is really about making sure that we bring the humanity back into the work. Anytime we talk about practices, there's people who are expected to adopt and implement those practices. And we need to really assess where are they at and what supports they need in order to be able to successfully implement those practices. Here are the ways in which we think about the systems of support that need to be in place. This is the how. How do we get those effective practices in place so more students are accessing the experiences to achieve the outcomes? There's different types of systems of support. Systems that support people reaching shared priorities around the outcomes, the expectations, and commitment for the work. Systems that support psychological safety and people to collaborate well. Many systems have protected time for collaboration, but it doesn't go well because people don't necessarily feel psychologically safe to speak truth about what's working and not working. Systems that support ongoing professional learning. How are we doing around those practices to achieve the outcomes? What do our people need in terms of ongoing learning? Systems that support protected time for reflection and planning. Systems that support people getting routine feedback on how they're implementing the practices. We call them fidelity audits that provide feedback to identify what's working and what are areas for growth and improvement. Systems that support remembering. Sometimes people need to be reminded more than they need to be retaught about the practices, especially when they're trying to work in the new effective practices as part of their professional habits. Systems that support people to get acknowledged and recognized for the energy and effort they put in to implement the effective practices in the service of achieving better outcomes for students. And last, systems that support removing barriers. There is no implementation without confronting barriers, and teams that really try to create systems that identify barriers and generate solutions to overcome those barriers enable people to stick with implementation versus abandoning it or drifting away. So the data piece, we've come around the whole model to live by. What data will routinely gather to inform continuous improvement decisions? And it boils down to collecting and intersecting student outcome data. What are the outcomes we're trying to achieve as a result of what we're doing? And how well are we implementing those practices? Because that enables us to locate and make a data-driven decision as to the next action step we're going to take to try to continuously improve what we do so more kids are accessing enriched experiences to move the needle on outcomes. And so you could just look at one of these quadrants. We intersect the student outcome data and the implementation data to really land on what is the decision that the data communicate to us that we should be doing as a next action step as we try to continuously improve to ensure more kids access the experiences they need to produce the outcomes we want. So I'm just going to wrap things up. Really, One way to think about the integration of social, emotional, and behavioral supports is to start with the outcomes and use that from a backwards design. What are the types of social, emotional, and behavioral outcomes you want to achieve and produce as a result of what you do? Really thinking through those proximal outcomes, because they're going to change more immediately and first in response to the experiences that you're able to create. Once we define what those experiences are, we got to hone in on the effective practices. What are the effective practices we're going to implement to bring to life those enriched experiences, those enriched relational experiences or environmental experiences or teaching learning experiences? Once we've honed in on the practices, we got to create systems of support that enable the adults to implement with fidelity. Ultimately, kids can't receive or benefit from things that aren't implemented. And last, we need to gather data so we have those data at our fingertips to spur continuous improvement as we try to make sure we're increasing the quality of experiences students are accessing in order to promote the types of social, emotional, and behavioral outcomes we know serve as enablers to their academic and life success. So I'll go ahead and open it up for Q&A now. I know that's been a whirlwind. I've asked people to kind of buckle up here as we discuss a wide range of topics as it comes to the integration of social, emotional, and behavioral supports and how that represents a pathway towards accelerating student learning.
Well, thank you, Dr. Cook. There are a few questions in the chat. The first one is, what are your thoughts about SEL being embedded in all interactions throughout the course of the school day and not just during quote unquote SEL time?
Yeah, I mean, the infusion, it shouldn't live on like Monday because I've seen systems do that. They might as well stop doing it until they're really ready to invest in infusing it throughout the day. There might be a place where the lesson, the main learning happens, but how are we coming back to it? And we're prompting and reminding kids of opportunities. We're debriefing, we're recognizing, reinforcing. People are celebrating the use of those skills. But I've seen systems treat it as something you do on Mondays and go, thank God we got that out of our way. Now we can move on to something else. There is no evidence that if you implement SEL like that, you're going to produce any better outcomes because kids really aren't accessing an enriched experience. It's more of like a compliance kind of approach to SEL.
Thank you. Another question that came up was, are there any practices that you would want to ensure are in place universally for all students that may have been more of a tier 2 practice pre-COVID and other events over the last couple of years?
I love that one. Heck yeah. I mean, because when tier 1's not in place, we know social, emotionally, and behaviorally and academically, a whole heck of a lot of kids look like they need an intervention. Relationships aren't a tier 2 intervention. Relationships are base and foundational, and we have a bunch of kids in schools that are currently not accessing healthy relationship with the person in charge of their learning environment. That fundamentally is not a tier 2. We're not going to intervene our way out of that one. That lives in the base environment. So that is something that a teacher might have to differentiate supports. Whether the environment is structured and predictable is not a tier 2 intervention. That means we have to push back in and support the adults to improve how predictable and consistent and structured their environment is. And that comes often through consultation to improve tier 1 and not saying we have to mobilize an intervention. I consider it like tier 1. If it's a dirty pond in the intervention, you pull the kid out of the dirty pond and you go to hose them off, they ultimately have to go back in the dirty pond. And so a lot of the work really lives in tier 1. Meanwhile, we also have kids who do need bona fide tier 2 or tier 3 supports that need to get activated.
Thank you. There's another question that just came in. It says that you briefly mentioned the role of curriculum in social emotional learning. With so much backlash against critical race theory, what ideas do you have to integrate marginalized humans in the curriculum and decenter whiteness and give exposure and voice to all lived experiences?
Yeah, I mean, this one is multi-layered. Number one, I believe this. There's no science in terms of sequencing. But if you're not attending to the environment and the context and the relationships on how healthy that is, and you're going after teaching kids competencies, it starts to feel like bootstrap theory a little bit in the sense of like, hey, we taught the people they should overcome the structural issues that are going on around them. No, we got to address those structural issues, environmental issues. That's why I believe in the sequencing. If we're going to start anywhere, we got to think about creating an equitable environment through culturally responsive PBIS and equitable access to relationships to make sure all kids are accessing those quality experiences that enable them to feel like they belong and they're connected to the community as a valued, respected member. And then we can start to think about how do we do really good, culturally responsive teaching around SEL competencies, because we do still want to empower kids. But if we're not attending to the environment, we're just going like from an inside out approach. Well, hey, let's teach kids how to just better regulate themselves, even though the environments they're in aren't healthy and they're toxic. So I just offer that. And then we can get into the weeds around, there's a lot of good frameworks on what culturally responsive kind of SEL teaching practices would look like that decenter around whiteness to make sure all kids are accessing those experiences and have a chance to, through the examples that are used, the attachment and connected to this, to their own identities and lived experiences, promote engagement and help youth from diverse backgrounds start to see the utility in some of the competencies. And the back end is more kids are likely to acquire, apply, and use those things. But yeah, I think that's where we're at. I think the old way of doing business, SEL alone, without attending to the environment, is harmful, and it's not attending to the broader context in which some of our youth exist, and they don't feel like they belong, and the environment currently is toxic for them.
Thank you. And then you mentioned a couple times the establish, maintain, restore PLC protocol, and I think you also mentioned scripts for practices to establish relationships like the banking time. Are those accessible to anybody who wants to find them? And if so, where might people find them?
Yeah, no, I could share with you. We've developed it to be absolutely for free, even with on-demand video modules for training and around the practices. Our EMR playbook outlines everything, our PLC protocol. I'll send you a link and it's all there accessible for free. I would just urge for any system to go slow to go fast, because if you really want to, from an implementation standpoint, do it well, it really makes it, we got to make some investments to protect some time. Without that PLC, our data indicate you won't get to the outcomes. You really have to protect PLC time to engage in that that structure kind of reflection planning process. That's what enables people to consistently implement and chip away at students' sense of belonging and connection. And we have other activities like an equity tree where people look at their relationships with kids and reflect on who has access to relationship and who doesn't, and how does gender relate to where kids are in my relationship tree, and how does race and ethnicity relate, and who needs it the most from me, because I can't give an infinite amount of time. Who needs attention the most?
Thank you. And then there's one last question in the chat. With the data component, do you suggest measuring outcome successes and dig into those experiences, or less successful outcomes?
Well, there's a couple of things. First, I think we always should monitor implementation before we even peek at student outcomes, because you can't gauge whether something's working until it's implemented. So there's always that caveat from an implementation perspective. And then, from a data collection around student outcomes, we need good data that actually speaks truth, and we need to disaggregate our data to really tell the story about for whom our practices are currently working and for whom our practices aren't currently working. And so we can tell a more nuanced story about what's working and not working in our school, and start to explore what might be missing in terms of effective practices, or adapting the practices we are implementing to ensure that they work and are received. Those experiences are received by different subgroups of kids.
Perfect. Thank you. And then the question I've been asking all our presenters as we wrap up is, what has been on one book that's been on your summer reading list?
I think that number one is Zaretta Hammond's. I think her ability to conceptualize culturally responsive teaching and introduce language that resonates with people is high on my list. As someone who's been originally steeped in supporting schools around social, emotional, and behavioral work, we can no longer do that work without centering it on equity. And we have to develop language to help people connect the dots. So that work has been inspirational. And if you haven't, you got to dig in. I imagine many of you have already dug into her work quite a bit.
Thank you. Well, it is officially after 3, and we cannot thank you enough for your time and your great information today. We really, really appreciate it.
Yeah, my pleasure.
All right. Have a good rest of your day.
You too.
Thanks, everybody.